So, because of the DNA test, we all know that Thomas Jefferson had fucked / raped Sally Hemings, his own slave, and he produced offspring with her. He had 6 children with one of his own slaves. Now, Sally Hemings was only 14 years old when she started working for Thomas Jefferson, and most likely, we're told, he was raping her 2 years later. Thomas Jefferson would have been 46 years old when she was 16, if that's to be believed. He would have been 44 when she was 14. So a 46-year-old founding father who authored the Declaration of Independence, which we just celebrated yesterday, was raping, statutory raping. Well, it wasn't statutory at the time, but it's statutory rape. It's rape because she's a property, so she didn't have any choice in the matter. She could not have left. So a prisoner is not able to make a contract, cannot consent to a contract. So Thomas Jefferson was raping a 16-year-old Sally Hemings, and then Thomas Jefferson forced Sally Hemings into a long-term relationship with her rapist, and then Thomas Jefferson forced the 16-year-old female that he was raping to produce 6 children for him. Now, Archibald K. Gaines would rape his slaves during the 9-month sabbatical when his wife was pregnant, which was said to have been common back then. Archibald K. Gaines is the Boone County, Kentucky plantation owner who owned Margaret Garner of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which was turned into a movie starring Oprah Winfrey. Margaret Garner became famous in January 1856 for slitting her own daughter's throat, which was said that she did instead of seeing her daughter go back into slavery. And she slit her daughter's throat just as the police had caught them in Ohio at an Underground Railroad property. Margaret Garner, her husband, her children, and others ran away from Archibald K. Gaines's Maplewood plantation in Kentucky near the Presbyterian Church on Richwood Road by crossing the frozen Ohio River. Margaret Garner may have killed her daughter because her daughter was the product of Archibald K. Gaines raping Margaret Garner. George Washington, as president, would sign the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 after the second U.S. Congress passed it. This is why the Kentucky police were able to chase Margaret Garner and her family out of Kentucky, a slave state, past the Ohio River, past the Mason-Dixon line, and into Ohio, a free state, because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that George Washington signed. Passing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was one of George Washington's main priorities. He passed it in February, just after he was reelected to a second term as president. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which strengthened George Washington's 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, was known as the Bloodhound Act by abolitionists because that's how the police caught the runaway slaves, by using bloodhounds. They would use bloodhounds to chase the runaway slaves down. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act was passed by the second U.S. Congress and signed into law by George Washington in order to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause, which was written in the original U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, which states, and I quote, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." This is in the U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, which will be nullified by the 13th Amendment later on, but it's still there. Check it out. The Fugitive Slave Clause in the American Constitution was written discreetly in order to cover up the fact that the U.S. Constitution sanctioned slavery, the forced enslavement of human beings, the enslavement by force. Do as you're told or else violence will happen to you, which is fascism. That's fascism, straight up. George Washington also chaired the 1787 Constitutional Convention that protected the sick, twisted, barbaric, peculiar institution of slavery, which is what they called it back then, a peculiar institution. Yeah, it's pretty fucking peculiar and twisted and sick and barbaric. 1787 would be 2 years before George Washington became president in 1789. 1787, when the Constitutional Convention convened, when they went off the Articles of Confederation and used the Constitution, was 4 years after the end of the War of Independence was over by the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and 11 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act made sure that African American slaves would forever remain property of their original master regardless of where they ran to in America. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act also made sure that anybody, white, brown, black, anybody that was on the Underground Railroad who helped the runaway slaves escape to freedom would be fined $500. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act also classified children born to fugitive slave mothers as slaves and property of the mother's master for the rest of their lives on earth. So, not just the slave that you bought, not just the female slave that you bought, but all of her children would be the master's property too. This act would apply to Oni Ona Judge, who had ran away from George Washington in 1796, and George Washington would chase Oni Judge until the end of his life, which would have been 3 years later in 1799 when he died when he was 67 years old. He never caught Ona. Ona Judge was a slave that got away from George Washington. George Washington had plenty of slaves to choose from for his rape sessions. When George Washington was 11 years old, he inherited 10 slaves when he was 11 years old in 1743. And by the time he died at age 67 in 1799, George Washington owned 318 slaves. George Washington owned slaves from his childhood all the way until his death. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, George Washington's wife, was ugly. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington looked like a man wearing a wig. I wouldn't fuck Martha Dandridge Custis Washington with your dick or your clit or whatever else any of y'all may have. But George Washington did not pick Martha Dandridge Custis Washington for her face. He married her because she was rich and connected. George Washington had many mistresses. He went dancing all the time with other women while he was married to Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. George Washington was in love with the dark-eyed beauty Sally Carey Fairfax, who he had met in his childhood. Sally Carey Fairfax taught George Washington how to dance the minuet when they were really young. Even though Sally Carey Fairfax was married to George William Fairfax, the eldest son of Sir William Fairfax, Virginia's largest landowner, and she remained ever faithful to her marriage. She also remained a close friend of George Washington and Martha Dandridge Custis's, visiting them frequently at Mount Vernon as an adult. In 1798, after Sally Carey Fairfax's husband had died, and therefore she was a lonely widow, George Washington wrote to Sally Carey Fairfax begging her to come back to Virginia to live in 1798, just 1 year before George Washington died. He still remembered these feelings that he had for a childhood love of his 1 year before he died, while he was married to Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. So just 1 year before he died, 1798, George Washington wrote to Sally Carey Fairfax, writing, and I quote, "Nothing could eradicate from my mind the recollection of those happy moments, the happiest in my life, which I have enjoyed in your company." Sally Carey Fairfax would eventually concede that marrying the worthy man would have been better than marrying the richly born. Unfortunately, it was way too late. George Washington did not love Martha Dandridge Custis. He didn't love her. Their marriage was a fucking sham. A loveless sham marriage. George Washington and Martha Dandridge Custis' marriage was purely a business arrangement. Nothing more. With Martha's land, wealth, and slave holdings, plus being a member of the ruling aristocracy at the time, George was able to expand his land, wealth, and slave holdings, in addition to adding to his sphere of influence in the early British aristocratic circles by marrying Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759, which was during the French and Indian War, which the British George Washington had started by straight up murdering Jumonville. So he married Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759 to get more land, get more money, get more slaves, and to expand his influence in the so-called connected circles, the connected British circles. And he married her in 1759 during the French and Indian War, which was a war he started. George Washington never fathered any children with Martha. The father of our nation, state, country wasn't even an actual father. Or maybe he was, but not with Martha Dandridge Custis. Martha Dandridge Custis never birthed any more George Washingtons for the world. Whether male or female, she never bore George any children. George Washington even speculated that had Martha had died, he would have tried to sire an heir. He would have tried to fuck somebody so he can have some of his own offspring to carry on his legacy, his property, his namesake. So this means that George Washington himself did not believe that he was impotent or infertile. He still believed that he could have had children. So, combine all these things together. Being in a loveless marriage with Martha Dandridge Custis for 40 years, since 1759 to the end of his life, never ever fathering any children with Martha Dandridge Custis, owning many female African American slaves on his property. His property, which consisted of nearly 60,000 acres of land, including 8,000 acres at Mount Vernon, Virginia, and over 50,000 acres in West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, and the Ohio country, which gave him plenty of space to conceal his raping crimes from the public. Although raping a slave wasn't a crime then, since their bodies were owned by George Washington and Martha Dandridge Custis. Their masters, their slaves' bodies were owned, as well as their slaves' children's bodies were also owned. And you don't even need 60,000 acres to conceal a crime. Philip and Nancy Garrido just needed 1/16 of an acre, just a small piece of ground in a California suburb, to kidnap, rape, and imprison J.C. Duggart for 18 years. So when one combines all of these facts together, it's clear as day that by the circumstantial evidence, George Washington probably raped his slaves.